Ukraine says it will support a proposed 30-day temporary ceasefire and work towards a critical minerals deal with the US after talks in Saudi Arabia. But Moscow has made no indication yet if it will agree to the plan. Dr. Jessica Genauer is a senior lecturer in international relations at Flinders University. She says there is little chance that Vladimir Putin will agree to the ceasefire in the immediate future.
So I think it's unlikely that President Putin is going to accept this proposal as quickly as President Zelenskyy did. And that's not because this proposal will not be in Russia's favor. In fact, having a ceasefire now advantages Russia because it means that essentially they're freezing the conflict lines with Russia in control of almost 20% of Ukrainian sovereign territory. But I think rather the reason why Putin will probably hesitate to quickly sign this proposal is because President Putin doesn't want to look to his domestic Russian population as though he is able to be bossed around essentially by President Trump. So part of Putin's whole narrative domestically is that he actually stands up to the United States, that Russia is just as strong as the United States, even though we know that's not true economically or militarily. But domestically, President Putin needs to reinforce that narrative. And if it looks like he's essentially been coerced into quickly signing a ceasefire, that's not going to do well for him domestically.
Yeah, so if he doesn't want to do that and be seen as weak in front of his people, would he work towards a counter-proposal and to water down what's there at the moment?
That's exactly right. So I think that what Putin is probably going to do is to essentially stall. I think that he'll maybe engage in some talks. He'll string out the US if he does agree, which he might, to a temporary cessation of hostilities such as currently been accepted. I think that it wouldn't be for at least a few weeks after he's managed to sort of craft a narrative to his own domestic population that in whatever way he's actually in control of what's happening. He's the one who's kind of making the decisions behind the scenes and who's actually, going to be getting something for Russia out of this temporary ceasefire. So I think at a minimum, we'd be looking at talks for a few weeks, if not longer, before we would see Russia agreeing to the kind of agreement, the kind of deal that's been suggested.
And can we read anything into the fact that hours after Ukraine agreed to the terms of the ceasefire in Saudi Arabia, that Moscow launched a massive air attack on Kyiv?
I think this is absolutely connected, but it's not a new pattern. So we've actually seen over the last couple of years, as Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has continued, and then we've seen also Russian attacks on Ukrainian civilian population centers. So we see that whenever Russia wants to essentially deter Ukraine or Ukraine's allies or partners from certain political moves or statements, we tend to get a ramping up of attacks on Ukrainian population. So yes, I do think that they are connected in some way.
Jessica, if, as you said, that Putin would say no to the current ceasefire on offer, how would it reflect on President Donald Trump? And I'm asking this in the context of that explosive Oval Office meeting with Volodymyr Zelenskyy.
Yeah, so we basically saw that this current agreement from Ukraine for a 30-day ceasefire with really not getting much in return. I mean, Ukraine wouldn't have wanted to agree to this without seeing more substantive security guarantees written into this kind of agreement. And the reason for that, I think, links back directly to that scene that we saw in the Oval Office where there was quite a serious altercation between President Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance and President Zelenskyy of Ukraine. And I think following that, President Zelenskyy essentially decided that Ukraine really needs to stay in, front of mind for the US. They need to make sure they can stay in discussions with the US and that very important US military aid and sharing of intelligence won't be completely cut off. So that's what's motivating Zelenskyy here.
Yes, I just wanted to read to you what Marco Rubio said in Saudi Arabia, in that if Russia say no, then we'll unfortunately know what the impediment is to the peace process here. So in that vein, would you expect a change in attitude from President Trump towards Moscow? Because it's been quite conciliatory so far.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think what's been really interesting to watch so far in President Trump's second term is that he's spoken very warmly about Russia, but we really have not heard much from President Putin. Now, that's not surprising because President Putin's modus operandi, and I think partly the reason that he's managed to stay in power for so long, is not to say too much. So he actually doesn't put himself out there very frequently on the sort of global public stage. He doesn't kind of get involved when there are, maybe issues that he considers to be more about other countries' domestic interests. So we've heard very little from President Putin. He certainly hasn't been speaking as warmly about Trump as Trump has about him. And whilst I do think that for President Trump, there's actually a personal aspect and a kind of an authenticity for him about the way in which he considers that he has a closer, more warm relationship with President Putin than he has with President Zelenskyy, I do think that we might see over coming weeks President Trump also bringing to bear this style of, we could call, brinkmanship that he likes to employ, where if Russia does not want to come to the table, does not want to agree to even a short-term ceasefire with Ukraine, we might then see President Trump starting to make some threats towards Russia. But I don't think that they will ever be as severe as the threats that he's made towards Ukraine in terms of essentially, cutting off all military aid to Ukraine and etc. And I also don't see that we'll ever see the type of behaviour towards President Putin from President Trump that we saw towards President Zelenskyy in the Oval Office a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, Jessica Genauer, really good to get your analysis today. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me on the program.